Today we are taking a look at an interaction between Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand that will showcase a microcosm of modern day politics, and it ends in a pretty funny way.
I just can't believe it. I can't believe it.
Just to set the table, we start off strong with Russell Brand, and I kid you not, suggesting to Peterson, the #1 hater of postmodernism, that there might be some value in the ideas emerging out of post-structuralism.
Perhaps the next marker of our progression might be when we can say, well, what is it that is of value in these ideas that are emerging out of post-structuralism? The sort of this willingness to cast out even nature. Even the body I'm born in isn't me. Nature itself isn't real. To hell with the sun. To hell with Jesus. To hell even with my own chromosomes. Neither the crucifix or the Y are of value in the final analysis.
Peterson doesn't really address this question directly, but let's take a look together. So Peterson is going to be taking the scenic route to answer this question, rolling out some of his greatest hits, but let's hear him out. Let's hear what he has to say.
I'm going to, you asked really, I think, two fundamental questions there. One had to do with the nature of authority and force, and the other had to do with fluidity. Oh yeah, there was a third one, which is what did the postmodernists bring to the table? Let's start with that. Well, here's one thing they got right. We see the world through a story. That's true. That's revolutionary, that truth. Right? And I think the science now points extremely strongly in that direction. The AI systems are trained in accordance with that notion.
The AI systems are trained in accordance with that notion. Well, as a researcher who does stuff adjacent to machine learning, I'm not sure. Maybe I didn't get the memo. Maybe I'm not interpreting what he's saying generously enough. Not sure, but I don't want to nitpick.
The great psychologist perception that I've studied and talked to have concluded the same thing. We see the world through a story. The description of the structure that we see the world through is a story. And we have to weight our perceptions. That goes back to that collective unconscious idea that we started with, is that we see the literal things we see. Our perceptions themselves are a function of that weighting process. They're a consequence of a narrative process. And so the postmodernists got that right. And that's why we have a culture war in part, because we're trying to work something out that's very deep. We see the world through a story. Is the story one of power and tyranny? Well, the answer to that is, to a large degree, unfortunately, but not fundamentally. And that's where the postmodern lefties go so terribly wrong, because their insistence is that the world is a battleground of power. And there isn't a more dangerous conclusion that you can possibly draw than that. Now, you still have to give the devil his due. So I'm going to consider briefly the story of Moses. Okay, you talked about the rod of authority, right? It's to be used sparingly. Well,
now here Peterson is going to be rolling out this biblical metaphor to make the point that one should not use force when he can use logos.
Moses is the archetypal leader and the main figure in the Old Testament, arguably speaking. And he has the flaws of the leader, even the prophetic leader. And the flaw is the proclivity to default to power. And he does that quite regularly. In some of Moses' actions are the kinds of consequences and motivations that someone like Dawkins would point to and say, a God who would produce a motivation that evil is not a God that I'm willing to abide by. Now, he says at the same time that he is a cultural Christian. So the situation is complex and people are starting to wake up to that fact. But Moses, his pattern of failure, his Achilles heel, is to use power when he's called upon to use invitation. And this is actually fatal in the final analysis. So in Numbers, which is where the story of Exodus basically concludes, Moses has shepherded his people through the desert, which is where you end up with when your tyranny crumbles, right? You end up in the desert, which is why people don't like to let go of their presuppositions. Anyways, he's shepherded through the desert basically for 3 generations, and they're on the border of the promised land. And the Israelites run yet again out of water, and they prevail upon Moses to intercede with God to provide water. And God tells Moses, there's some rocks nearby. You go tell those rocks to deliver the water. You go speak to those rocks properly, and they'll deliver the water that will save your people. And Moses goes to the rocks, and he hits the rocks twice, not once, but twice with his staff. Now this staff, this is the rod of Asclepius. This is the flag you plant when you establish new territory. This is the liana or vine that connects heaven and earth. It's the staff that defeats the staff of the court magicians. It's the staff that turns into the serpent that eats all the other serpents. This is a major league staff, right? It's the authority of Moses. And he uses authority when he's called upon to use the logos. That's his sin. And the consequence of that is dire. Aaron, so the political arm, dies. And Moses is forbidden from entering the promised land. And so what's the rule there? The rule is, to the patriarch, let's say, the rule is, do not use force when you...
Here, see, Peterson is making his point, as he often does, through a metaphor, a biblical metaphor, that even though maybe you have power, you have authority, you shouldn't always wield that authority. And, I think most people would agree. Keep in mind, he's using the word logos here, so he's saying you should use reason and rationality.
You could use invitation. Don't fall prey to that temptation. Now, the left looks at the patriarchy and says, nothing but force. It's like, wait a minute, guys. Nothing but. That's a bit too extreme a claim. You mean nothing but? It's like, okay, why the hell are your lights on? No, look around you. You think all of that's a consequence of force, do you? You think that's all of that productivity, all of that life more abundant, all of that material wealth? You think that's a consequence of nothing but force. You think your marriage is nothing but force. You think your family is nothing but force. You think your community, your friends, all business relationships, that's nothing but power, is it? And
No, I don't think really nearly anybody. I think this is a very fringe view on the left, but they think that all their relations is nothing but power. And it's a sad view, and it's a view that deserves to be criticized, as Peterson is pointing out now. But I must point out the fact that regarding the fluidity part of the question, that I thought was interesting, the fact that Russell Brand was saying, to hell with the chromosomes, to hell with X and Y. Peterson didn't really answer that part of the question, or maybe he took, as I was saying, the scenic route. But anyway, let's continue.
And why am I supposed to believe that you're not saying that just to justify your own use of power? Because that's how the radicals, that's how they operate, as far as I can tell. It's like, well, the world's just a battleground of power. And the only thing important is who has the rod. And that's a big problem, because no, that's not a solution. And there's a lot of self-service in the claim that power rules. It's very, very, very dangerous. Now, if it isn't power, what is it? Well, it's the antithesis of power. When Christ is the third temptation that's offered to Christ when he's in the desert and he encounters Satan is the temptation of power. And so which he refuses. And so we can derive from that the idea that the pattern of Christ's life is the antithesis of power. And what you see in that life is the constant refusal to use force no matter what, right? And the Roman soldiers make fun of him. They say, well, if you're the Son of God, why don't you come off the cross and lay the landscape to waste, which is, at least in principle, within the purview of possibility. And the answer is, well, you're not allowed, in the final analysis, you're not allowed to use force no matter what.
I don't know exactly what Peterson is trying to say right now, because I'm pretty sure he wants to put violent murderers in prison too, and we do that through the use of force. So this tangent on the fact that you don't use force no matter what, no force. And by the way, this is not the first time I hear him say this. He's kind of repeating this a lot lately. You don't use force no matter what. But does he? It's just a false claim, right? If I wanted to be charitable, and I want to be charitable, I would guess that, he's saying that you should use force only in a final analysis. You should use force only when there's no other alternative. But, I don't know. It's a bit weird to phrase it as he is phrasing it. The radical Jordan Peterson wants to defund the police. This is the problem sometimes with evocative language, with metaphorical language, with hyperbole, that sometimes you say things they're not really true, are they? But anyway, the point here that is going to be important for us is that, Peterson is championing logos, and I agree with him. He's saying we shouldn't use authority when we can use reason, rationality, when we can present a data-driven argument, and we can present this argument with sound and valid premises that lead to a conclusion that should bring us closer to truth. And it's wonderful, great. Now, because it's going to be important for later, there's other two modes of persuasion that both come from ancient Greek to us. And these are ethos. And ethos is an appeal to authority, an appeal to credibility, an appeal to credentials, to ipsi dixit, to the authority. This is what Peterson was saying with this major league staff. This major league staff is an appeal to authority. And God was angry that Moses used ethos instead of logos when talking to the rocks. And then there's another mode of persuasion that is pathos. And pathos is the appeal to emotions, the appeal to your feelings, to your gut instincts about things. And that's another way to persuade people, yes. So keep in mind these three modes of persuasion because they're going to be relevant to what we're going to be discussing.
Right, invitation, logos, not force.
Logos.
And that seems to be tangled into this idea of voluntary self-sacrifice as the antithesis of power.
Perhaps then, Jordan, what we might explore is something that I think I heard Emmett Fox describe, was that were we to be invited to save but one soul or entire material empires, we always choose the soul, and I suppose also in the Bhagavad Gita, choose Krishna above all the artillery and armory in the world and the greatest weapons available. Choose only Krishna, choose always the divine. That if Christ's power is not materially practiced, and yet indeed we find once more at the centre of the discourse that word, that concept, power, the word and concept upon which the postmodernists arrived and you say reductively alighted as conclusive. I wonder, might we consider that where this battlefield ultimately resides is internally, for surely Christ's actions indicate that his power is in self-sacrifice and in inaction and in the refusal to implement force. Clearly, when you describe these benefits, if not glory, the practical application and operation of culture and the legacy of the patriarchy of Western civilization, the institutions flawed but yet functioning, it's clearly reductive to say that that is naught but force. I suppose yet they may say the benefits are inadvertent consequences only afforded in the same way, just to use an example off the top of my head, that the eventual end of slavery ultimately delivers a workforce that gives you the idea of progress but still allows establishment interests to operate quite comfortably.
So yeah, here Russell Brand is trying to steelman the postmodern view, although I believe he's trivializing and banalizing it, but he's trying to steelman the view that there's always an establishment, that even if we get out of slavery, there's wage slavery afterwards. So there's always these powerful people that govern society, the elites, the establishment. Now, I don't think the postmodern view of power, especially for one of Michel Foucault, that was really the guy who was talking the most about power. I think that's not really the conception of power that Foucault was after, because he thought that power, at least I believe, could be found basically everywhere in society. It was kind of omnipresent in all human relations. So it's a bit of a different notion. But anyway, Russell Brand is confronting Peterson with this kind of weirdly steeled man view of his ideas regarding postmodernism. And why he's doing it is because you see, Brand and Peterson find themselves on the same side of the political spectrum lately, at least, but they're on different ends. They're on different quadrants in a way, because Russell Brand is more on the populist, on the right-wing populist side of the political spectrum. And here the academic definition of populism is a big distrust versus the establishment, the elites, this amorphous establishment that is not ever really truly well defined, but it can be an ethnic group, it can be defined based on class, the billionaires, but it can be defined even based on competences, technocrats or stuff like that. But in any case, the academic definition of populism is one where there's a heavy distrust for the elites, and Russell Brand is on that side of the right-wing political spectrum. While Peterson, although he has been veering more towards populism lately, he's still more on the traditionally conservative side. So he's more traditional conservative, so he wants to go back to some certain norms that are in the past, maybe that are God-given in his case. But he doesn't really have all this hatred towards an establishment. Okay, so we see a kind of difference here, and that's why there's a little bit of tension. There's not, these two people are friendly, of course, they're having a friendly conversation, but there's a little bit of tension in the ideas behind what we're saying. Okay, so let's see what happens here. But it is quite telling, actually. It's quite telling what happens right here.
I don't think there's any reason to dispute the reality of the claim that the fundamental landscape well, I think the fundamental landscape is good and evil, but right on top of that is tyranny and slavery. So if we go back to the story of the Israelites, if we go back to the Exodus story, you have there the claim that the reality the leader always contends with, always, is the reality of tyranny and slavery at every level. And that's something like a power dynamic. But that doesn't mean that the solution to the problem is that the slaves become the tyrant.
See, the solution to a problem is not that the slave becomes the tyrant. And here, what I think, at least, what I believe Peterson is saying here is that the solution is not that you overthrow the establishment. The solution is not that you overthrow the elites. Because Peterson is worried of the revolutionary tendencies that underlie populism. Because populism is not only found on the right, it's also found on the left. And Peterson is more on the other, has a different bend of things in the political spectrum. And so here this difference comes out in the conversation. Let's continue.
In fact, that's a solution that's offered to Moses as a possibility. In fact, the Israelites clamor for it, just like they later clamor for a king. The slaves want a king. Is the slave tyranny dimension or the slave tyrant dichotomy played out in the capitalist landscape? Well, obviously.
No swearing, Jordan.
Like, obviously. I don't see that there needs to be a dispute about that. It's as an entry player in the capitalist world, you play out the slave-tyrant dichotomy. And you might say, well, that means the slaves should overthrow the tyrants, right? But that doesn't address the fundamental problem. The problem is, think about it this way. How the hell do you stop being a slave? Well, a slave to what? Well, we could start, you already described this to some degree. How about you stop being a slave to your own goddamn whims? Right? Like, exactly how is this battle to free yourself from slavery to be undertaken? Well, we're going to restructure the entire economic system. It's like, oh, you're going to do that, are you? You're going to do that. You can't even make your bed. You're the prisoner of your own whim. You're a slave to your own desires. There's nothing to you. If you did manage the revolution, the monsters you release would take you out so fast that you wouldn't have time to think, and it wouldn't be pleasant. And we've seen that time and time again. Like, the solution to the slave-tyrant dichotomy isn't political revolution. So you see that reflected again in the Passion story. The mob that's upset with Christ is upset, at least in part, because he refuses to play the role of political revolutionary. And so, because that's not the way out of the slave-tyrant dichotomy. The way out is to stop being a bloody slave. Now, how? Well, I think that's partly the pathway of maturation, isn't it? Is that it's voluntary service to a higher good. It's something like that. This is what God tells Moses to tell the tyrants and the Israelites. And we always get this wrong. We always forget the second half of this. So this is a civil rights shibboleth. Moses tells the tyrant, the Pharaoh, let my people go. That's Martin Luther King, but that's not what he says. He says it 10 times, just in case you didn't catch it the first time. He says, let my people go so they may worship me in the desert. And that means to establish a particular kind of relationship outside the tyranny in the wilderness that, well, it speaks of the responsibility of each person to take on the existential burden of existence, voluntarily, right? To become a locus of authority and responsibility themselves, because otherwise they abdicate that responsibility to the tyrant.
So here Peterson is bringing out his solution to the fact that there's this tyrant-slave dichotomy throughout society. There's a hierarchy. There's people who are more powerful and less powerful. And Peterson's solution is to work individually, to work on yourself. It's not to overthrow the masters, the establishment, the elites, but it's individual work on yourself. And here you, again, see the differences between their two political views. Going back to the methods of persuasion we've seen before. Well, there's logos, with which I agree with Peterson. That's something that should work on a lot. But ethos and pathos, well, Peterson and Russell Brand are masters at ethos and pathos. They're absolute masters. They're 99 percentile, these guys. Now, they have their different styles, but they're good at using. Well, Peterson can use. I've seen him use all three, and that's when you're actually quite deadly when you use all three in combination. But both Peterson and Brand are extremely skilled rhetorically. But they have different styles. Peterson is more of an ethos kind of guy because he appeals more to authority. He has this aura of professionalism that is given to him even by his academic credentials. And he appeals to the authority of God, to these old stories that have lasted millennia. So he is usually bringing his stuff more through the ethos pathway of persuasion, while Russell Brand is more of a pathos guy. He's more trying to appeal to your passions, your emotions, trying to appeal to his personal life stories of how he overcome his hedonism, and now he's embracing God completely, embracing the mother, embracing the son, and he sees behind these symbols all this passion and emotion. You can feel it through him, and he's really good at that. But they're both extremely rhetorically skilled, as I just said. It's of course a gift, but it's also a danger. And this, by the way, was one of the main points of the film Dune. If you've seen Dune at the cinema, one of the main points is to beware of charisma. Beware of people who are charismatic. They can make you believe things, and this is the point, through ethos and pathos and not through logos. So when you listen to these skilled rhetoricians speak, and it's full of types like this on the internet, you should always carefully try to analyze what they're saying. But let's continue.
That's not fundamentally a political problem. It has political ramifications, but, like your decision to become a father, that's not a political decision. And your ability to be a good father is also, that's not a political choice. It's something far deeper than that. To the degree that you're a good father, which is an abstract role, hence the name father, you're going to be a conduit for the spirit of, for the benevolent spirit of your ancestors. That's a perfect.
You know what? I must say something that when, Peterson and Russell Brand do this ethos and pathos stuff, they do, it's sometimes it can become a bit messy because they introduce all of these ideas together and can sometimes make things a bit harder to understand. Like you have to really pay attention. And I'm not sure even if you really pay attention, if all these connections 100% make sense. If you know what I'm saying? Well, anyway.
Perfectly reasonable way of thinking about it. You're going to let the spirit of the Father pour through you and occupy you, right? And that's a form of worship and subordination. It's not power.
I love it. I love that. Often in my wife, we have a young son, as you know, and
that.
I see flashes of the archetype. I see how she is governed by what I suppose Richard Dawkins would call natural processes, but I see beyond that, I see the light that shines. I see behind the behaviour, behind the biology. I feel the resonance that she is redolent with the spirit of the ancestors, that she is not just their mother, but she is the mother. How could any woman sacrifice so much? How could any woman continue to provide so unquestioningly and so diligently? I'm struck by several things. It's plain that there is a negotiation, and it seems to me that what you're saying is that the era of this new progressive, postmodern, sort of Marxist, to use your sort of the language that you would use, even if I would sort of query that language, there is a negotiation, and that negotiation, of course, must involve power. I'm struck that what Moses carries out politically against a sort of another king, an alternative king in the Pharaoh, and as the head of a tribe, Christ carries out as an emissary alone and in the desert. There are parallels. The desert is a parallel. The adversarial nature of the sort of combat, there is a parallel there. But in these distinctions, I suppose there must be information, given that we are operating on the assumption that this is operating, as this is your term, as a library and a sort of as a progressive discourse that's deliberately trying to induce a state. And perhaps it's the states that we're describing quite simply in the father, the mother, a role that may be useful to us. And what I feel is what I feel a hero, yes, to be worthy of the term. Yeah. And what I feel like is important now, certainly what feels important to me, is what is it that I am to revive? How is it that I will continue to incline towards this ancestral greatness? What is the duty, and how might the power of logos impact reality differently than force? And
Now, Russell Brand took a lot of time to reach a coherent point, I think, in his appeals to pathos and some ethos coming from the Lord. But anyway, and then he makes his point: how might the power of logos impact reality differently than force? But you see, remember before that it was the staff, the Major League staff, that was the power, and the logos was the invitation, according to Peterson. So here we see another difference between the two, that Russell Brand sees logos as a force, as something that forcefully impacts reality, while Peterson was saying something different before. So there's kind of a disagreement between the two, or a miscommunication at the least, in this regards. Just to be a bit more scientifically accurate in what we're saying, two of our best current models of persuasion, the elaboration likelihood model and the systematic heuristic model, they tell us that we have two routes to persuade somebody. And these routes mix and match very well with the triangle of persuasion given to us by the ancient Greeks, in the sense that One route of persuasion is one that it's called the peripheral route to persuasion, the system one route to persuasion. And you can persuade somebody through your authority, or through appeals to emotions, appeals to feelings, or through appeals to credibility. You see, one route of persuasion is through ethos and pathos. And then there's another route to persuasion, and this one is the one that's going to be according to logos, according to reason, according to data-driven arguments that carefully ask you to reflect on their validity, their soundness. And these two paths of persuasion are very different. One is very efficient. The system one path, the peripheral route, is very efficient. It's very quick to persuade somebody with authority on emotions. While the other path is more laborious, and one has to put more effort into trying to persuade somebody, and it's way more inefficient in a way. But we know because the science tells us that the logos part to persuasion brings us closer to having more accurate beliefs about the world. It brings us closer to truth, goddammit. And when you have these hyper-charismatic figures involved in the conversation, you should always be careful, be wary, that you could be persuaded by these people on the basis of appeals to authority, on a basis of appeals to emotions, emotional appeals. I'm just setting the table because now Russell Brand is skeptical of the power of logos. He sees the power of logos as impacting virality through force, and he's contradicting a bit what Jordan Peterson said previously, because his metaphor was casting logos as an invitation. And I think that's correct. Actually, if I had to metaphorically talk about these things, I would say that logos is more of an invitation, while ethos and pathos are more forceful, they're more powerful. They're more a way to get your way with people. They're a way to, convince people not on the basis of their rational abilities, but circumventing the rational abilities. So with all of this in mind, let's move on.
Okay, so let me ask you that specifically. Like, you're quite the wizard of words now, and so you have that as a gift. Now, you've detailed out your subjugation to the land of whim, let's say, and now you have this podcast, you have a public presence. You've been vouchsafed that.
This is your podcast. I'm in your podcast right now. This is your podcast. So now we're getting somewhere. When it becomes an absolute amorphous podcast where the father and son don't even know, because the spirit is so abundant and all immersive that we don't even know who's Moses, who's the Pharaoh, who's Jesus, who's the serpent. Now we're getting somewhere, baby.
The pathos of Russell Brand, well, it had its effect on Peterson, who's now gotten emotional because Russell just interrupted him and he used all this pathos. But the interesting part here is that Peterson is trying to ask a question to Russell Brand about the importance of language. That how do you know you're using your gifts of language responsibly? How do you know you're using your gifts of language goddamn responsibly? And it's a very interesting question. And I'm happy that Peterson asked this question because it's an interesting one to ask a person like Russell Brand. The section is titled The Consequences of Using Words Properly and Carefully. So let's hear Peterson, pose this question. Let's hear.
Well, so it seems to me the it's all of our podcast, Russell. So it seems to me that the simplest place for people to start with regard to finding their pathway forward is to be very careful with their words. And I want to know something personal from you. It's like, I believe that what you're doing on your podcast is attempting to find your way forward carefully. You're investigating and exploring, and that's the answer to the question about amorphous identity. It's like the people who push forward the notion that identity is fluid. That's the case if you're progressing forward in exploration and trying to expand your domain of responsibility, let's say. It's not true if what you're doing to be fluid in your identity is the abandonment of all responsibility whatsoever, right? So, and those can look casually very similar. Now, I want to know from you, it's like, what is it that you're doing with your words when you're doing what you should be doing? And what's the consequence? What's been the consequence of that for you and for your reputation and for, what would you say, for your dynasty and for everyone else? It's the same Abrahamic question. If you use your words properly, I mean, first of all, do you? If you do, why? When you do, what happens? How do you know when you deviate from that? And what do you think your responsibility is in that regard?
Thank you.
So keep in mind the question asked here. The question asked here is one of, how do you know you're using your words responsibly? how do you know when you go too far with using your skills of rhetoric that you've been given? That anybody can see you're a very skilled wordsmith, but are you using these gifts for good? Let's hear his response. Let's hear.
The prayer of Jabez, I think in Chronicles 2, oh, that you would bless me indeed and enlarge my territory, that your hand would be with me, that you would keep me from evil. I feel that with words...
That's a good one.
Yeah. I feel like with words, I'm trying to generate community. I'm trying to use language to create common unity, to instantiate and realise an inherent and already existing connection, and that we live individually and collectively in a super state of potentiality, that he has no hands but ours, that we are here to formulate his kingdom, that as we have already referenced, that we are his apostles, that this is our duty. Now, experientially how that is, as you have kindly suggested, it is indeed a gift and therefore requires no effort, requires only acceptance and a receptive state. When I'm in this receptive state, the communication is effortless. I'm almost not a participant. It seems to me that what the polarity is precisely as you have described, that I am a vessel for and a vehicle upon my instincts. The flow of my instincts are that we had the senses, are that we had the instruments to observe the patterns that might be about us, the endocrinal streams that may yet flow and where they carry me and with what telos and with what purpose in mind. Upon these with my rod I try to impose, Jordan, yes, an ancestral inheritance of some value. And the battleground for me is the inculcation of this ego. It was very, very well done by the culture. The raw material of the appetites was, they did good work with this clay. So easy if you feel a continual lack, as one might if you have not yet been shown a path to God. So easy to worship their herd of golden calves that they lay before you, and all of the bounties that are on offer. It seems to me that it isn't, and this is from what I have learned from other alcoholics and addicts that walk the path ahead of me, that it isn't the external stimulant that must be addressed and overcome. No, it is the receptive pole. It is the coordinate. It is the inner coordinate that must be overcome. And I see what you mean now in the difference between the use of the staff and logos. And I imagine you're using that word because there is no perfect English interpretation available for it. And this kind of active awareness, this kind of active presence, making ourselves, as I try in the rosary, to imagine the vibrant nothingness, to feel the vibrant nothingness, and here within the vibrant nothingness is the Sacred Mother, and it is her that I petition that she may convey to her son the God that she grew in her belly, that I pray to be forgiven. But not me as an individual, but me just as one more sheep, just as one more member of the flock. If I can overcome the appurtenances of my identity that I have been adorned with and self-adorned, that I have ornamented endlessly, that with the brush lent to me by the culture, with the lacquer that I've squeezed out of every gland, applied to fortify this shibboleth of self. If I can somehow overcome that, and where might I overcome it but in the present? Where but the present? Where but as you say, the message of Christ, the absolute refusal to use force, that the higher will might be engaged, that the higher purpose might find its fulfillment. The challenge, Jordan, that I would offer you, inquiry rather, sir, is that the acceptance that what is happening is God's will, that the suffering is God's will, to let it go to work on you, that the opposite, as I was taught recently, the opposite of faith is not doubt, the opposite of faith is certainty. And that to live in this, the horror of uncertainty, and to live there with grace, a grace that I cannot self-generate, even if the source of all things must include me somehow, that is the ongoing challenge. And with language, I suppose I hope to illustrate that there are connections in these patterns of differences, in these signifiers that may yet be arbitrary. I do see the markings of some fractal archetype. Perhaps the success of the language that we're currently using is meritocratic, maybe in its jagged consonants and flowing vowels, in its labial fricatives, in its linguistic grace. There is something akin to truth emerging if we will just allow it.
Well, so...
Keep in mind. Keep in mind the question was the poor question. The poor brutalized question was, how do you know you're using your language responsibly? Poor Peterson. And I just can't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe he would give this answer to the question on how do you use your bloody language responsibly. How do you know you're using your gifts of rhetoric responsibly? And he just word salads Jordan Peterson. He just completely word salads him. And and they posted this. And afterwards they decided, yeah, we're going to post this. Oh my god, it's so brutal. It's so brutal in a way. It's so brutal, like... I don't know, I think maybe I should be worried, actually. Maybe I'm taking crazy pills. It's just... There's a level in which maybe I should be very worried that this just goes on and nobody bats an eyelid. Nobody bats an eyelid, like the... And by the way, Peterson is going to completely change the subject. I can't imagine what was going on in Jordan's brain right now. He was like, I'm going to ask you a question. And it's lovely because Russell Brand says, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. Proceeds to sophistry and sophistry to the squared sophistry. Now, let's do our due diligence and try to understand if that actually was a word salad or if there was, or if I'm mistaken. Now, I'm sure people in the comment can correct me if I'm mistaken.
And for everyone else, it's the same Abrahamic question. If you use your words properly, I mean, first of all, do you? If you do, why? When you do, what happens? How do you know when you deviate from that? And what do you think your responsibility is in that regard?
Peterson is trying to ask, what do you think? Probably something that he thought about himself. What is, as a master of ethos, as a master of rhetoric, what is your responsibility talking to these millions of people?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
The prayer of Jabez, I think, in Chronicles 2, oh, that you would bless me indeed and enlarge my territory, that your hand would be with me, that you would keep me from evil.
Okay, so let's be charitable. Let's be charitable. Let's regain composure and try to be professional. So this makes perfect sense. He's just saying he's, using this evocative language, charged with ethos, coming from God, that if I have this great power, that God will not make me use this power for evil. I don't want to use this power for evil. So this, in the context of a question, this makes sense.
I feel that with words...
That's a good one.
Yeah. I feel like with words, I'm trying to generate community. I'm trying to use language to create common unity, to instantiate and realise an inherent and already existing connection, and that we live individually and collectively in a super state of potentiality. That he has no hands but ours.
So he's trying to bring forth with language a sense of community.
We are here to formulate his kingdom, that, as we have already referenced, that we are his apostles, that this is our...
Yeah, so the sense of community is actually a religious community, in the sense that it's, with his words, Russell Brand is trying to bring forth the word of God, the kingdom of God. So he's trying to become a vehicle for the words of God. I would say this is a charitable interpretation of what he's saying here.
Duty. Now, experientially how that is, as you have kindly suggested, it is indeed a gift and therefore requires no effort, requires only acceptance and a receptive state.
Okay.
When I'm in this receptive state, the communication is effortless. I'm almost not a participant. It seems to me that what the polarity is precisely as you have described, that I am I am a vessel for and a vehicle upon my instincts.
Okay, here he is describing the phenomenological experience of what happens when he's in doing these monologues. Yes, this he's describing his emotions while he does this monologue, what he feels, his phenomenology, in a way. Okay, now, of course, I'm trying to be as charitable as I possibly can with my interpretation now. Of course, everything is infused with a lot of pathos. Now, this is an interesting part, but for other reasons. So here...
The flow of my instincts are that we had the senses, are that we had the instrument...
So here, see, he says that when he's in this state, he just allows his instincts to completely take control, and he just lives in the moment with his instincts. And it's interesting because Russell Brand's... one of the appeals of Russell Brand is the fact that he was once this hedonist
who would engage in all these sex acts, who would have everything he wanted at his fingertips in society. And he would, allow his instincts to take over, and he would, engage in this hedonistic debauchery. But here he's saying that when he engages in this rhetoric, in this stream of words, this stream of consciousness that he brings to us, that he's engaging in instincts. He's letting his instincts take over. One could see this as a way of, engaging in a kind of hedonism, to use this rhetoric to get your way with people, or to make a lot of money, or to convince people through the peripheral route of persuasion. Yeah, there's a weird tension here. But okay, we're just trying to analyze clarity for the moment.
To observe the patterns that might be about us, the endocrinal streams that may yet flow, and where they carry me, and with what telos and with what purpose in mind. Upon these with my rod I try to impose, Jordan, yes, an ancestral inheritance of some value. And
Yeah, so here he's saying, I'm using my words to impose the ancient ancestral word of God. It's not so poetic when you put it this way, but okay, not so poetic now.
Battleground for me. The battleground for me is the inculcation of this ego. It was very, very well done by the culture. The raw material of the appetites.
And now he's going to go into his experiences, his personal experiences with hedonism that are not really that relevant to the question, so I'm kind of getting a bit annoyed, but okay.
They did good work with this clay. So easy if you feel a continual lack, as one might if you have not yet been shown a path to God. So easy to worship their herd of golden calves that they lay before you, and all of the bounties that are on offer. It seems to me that it isn't, and this is from what I have learned from other alcoholics and addicts that walk the path ahead of me, that it isn't the external stimulant that...
I look at... Peterson is really trying to... I think Peterson right now is like, I hope, oh please don't sophistry me. Please don't just produce a complete word salad right now. Is this what you're doing? Are you really going to produce a word salad right now when I ask you about the responsibility of using your language properly? Is this what's going on? Anyway, so, okay, so Russell Brand is trying to bring forth the word of God.
Must be addressed and overcome. No, it is the receptive pole. It is the coordinate. It is the inner.
By the way, I'm not sure about this, what he's saying here regarding addicts, but actually you have to... What has to be overcome is the inner coordinate. It's the receptive pole. I'm not really sure that's actually the case, even for addicts. But anyway, even if we take this for granted, I have a feeling that he sees this inner coordinate, this receptive pole, as logos. I have a feeling in what he's going to say afterwards that he sees this as a bit of a... It doesn't say it explicitly, so I'm not sure, but let's continue.
A coordinate that must be overcome. And I see what you mean now in the difference between the use of the staff and logos. And I imagine you're using that word because there is no perfect English interpretation available for it. And this kind of active awareness, this kind of active presence, making ourselves, as I try in the rosary, to imagine the vibrant nothingness, to feel the vibrant nothingness.
Now this, I believe, is just a deepity, as Daniel Dennett would say. The philosopher Daniel Dennett would call this a deepity, something that seems like it's saying a lot, but it's not really deep at all. It doesn't reveal to us any new knowledge, any new insight. If I had to be very charitable, I would say that these words would be a description of a phenomenological experience of Russell Brand while he is in this flow state and he is talking in this way and he feels the vibrant nothingness. He's just present with I don't know. Okay.
And here within the vibrant nothingness is the Sacred Mother, and it is her that I petition that she may convey to her son the God that she grew in her belly, that I pray to be forgiven. But not me as an individual, but me just as one more sheep, just as one more member.
Now here, this is all well and good, but I don't know what it has to do with the question. He's praying to be forgiven as one sheep, and I want to be forgiven too as one sheep. It sounds nice. It sounds nice and entertaining if you want.
of the flock, if I can overcome the appurtenances of my identity that I have been adorned with and self-adorned, that I have ornamented endlessly, that with the brush lent to me by the culture, with the lacquer that I've squeezed out of every gland, applied to fortify this shibboleth of self, if I can somehow overcome that, and where
how are you going to overcome it, Russell? How? Just explain to us how through the use of language. The question was on the responsible use of language, Russell.
I overcome it, but in the present. Where but the present? Where but as you say, the message of Christ, the absolute refusal to use force, that the higher will might be engaged, that the higher purpose might find its fulfillment. The challenge, Jordan, that I would offer you, inquiry rather, sir, is that the acceptance that what is happening is God's will, that the suffering is God's will, to let it go to work on you, that the opposite, as I was taught recently, the opposite of faith is not doubt, the opposite of faith is certainty. And that to live in this, the whole...
So I'm not sure, is logos certainty, is this what he's trying to say, or maybe he's just, trying to... Maybe all of this is to go against logos, the certainty of logos. Maybe he's trying to live in the rhetoric of ethos and pathos. He's trying to tell us that he wants to live in that uncertainty, that he doesn't want to reach a truth, an objective truth, because an objective truth would be the opposite of faith. So he wants to live in an uncertainty, in the horror of an uncertainty, but he wants to feel the suffering of the horror of the uncertainty. So maybe this is deep down what he's trying to say, that he just wants to live through ethos and pathos alone.
Horror of uncertainty, and to live there with grace, a grace that I cannot self-generate, even if the source of all things must include me somehow. That is the ongoing challenge. And with language, I suppose I hope to illustrate that there are connections in these patterns of differences, in these signifiers that may yet be arbitrary.
This is a lovely part, because here he's using language that could have came straight out of grammatology, of Derrida. So if, and Derrida, Jordan Peterson calls Derrida the chief trickster of postmodernism. He really dislikes Derrida, and signifiers that may yet be arbitrary is very reminiscent of postmodern language that Derrida would use. So, yeah, I don't really know what he's talking about right here. By the way, go ahead, steel man what he's saying in the comments, and I will listen, and I will take a look.
I do see the markings of some fractal archetype. Perhaps the success of the language that we're currently using is meritocratic, maybe in its jagged
What? Now it's meritocratic then? So, because meritocracy seems to presuppose a hierarchy of meaning in language, and I don't know, I'm getting a bit frustrated in trying to be charitable in the interpretation of what he's trying to say. The problem is that it's not that it's impossible to interpret, it's that there's so many interpretations I could give to this speech. There's so many interpretations I could give, and this makes it too vague to, I think, be of use to many people, although it sounds good, and I want to be forgiven too. I want to be a sheep that's forgiven. I too want to be a sheep that's forgiven.
Consonants and flowing vowels, in its labial fricatives, in its linguistic grace. There is something akin to truth emerging if we will just allow it.
But wait a minute, but I thought you said you wanted to live in the uncertainty. So now you are hoping that there's some truth emerging in these fricatives. So now you are for truth, but before you said we had to learn to live in the uncertainty, because uncertainty is faith, and certainty is the opposite of faith. So the truth seems more similar to certainty. So yeah, I don't know, but there probably is a way to. There are multiple ways, I guess, to interpret this. One way is just like as a performance art kind of thing that is championing ethos and pathos, and it hates logos. Another one is to say that actually, through my use of language, I am using logos. There is a truth emerging at some point, but because it's all so confused, and this, by the way, is one of the problems with using so much evocative and metaphorical language, and I would levy this criticism also to Peterson too, that sometimes if you just overdo it, are you confusing people more than helping them? Are you bringing them closer to truth by using language in this way? And it's so deeply ironic because the question was about language, That's a part that completely blows me away. It just melts my brain. What is going on? What?
Well, so let me ask you something that's more personal than this is my observation, and you tell me if it's accurate.
And here Peterson just asks him something about his personal life, about so many intellectuals coming back to Christ. So he completely... And here, by the way, Peterson should have challenged him. Peterson, you should have challenged Russell Brand here. You should have said, "Excuse me? What the hell are you talking about? I asked you a question on using language, on the responsibility of using your gifts of rhetoric appropriately. And you produced this word salad to me?" You should have said, "Do you think it's appropriate to answer this question like this? How can I trust you, Russell Brand? How can I trust you?" Let me just end because it's going on for a long time, but there's one main point I want to make is that, see, through our technological innovations, we have magnified the power of ethos and pathos incredibly. Because now, before you go to bed, you can scroll on your phone, you can watch these clips of people who are full of ethos and pathos, and you can be convinced of stuff. And you have YouTube, you have all these screens, the television. We have incredibly magnified the peripheral route of persuasion, the system one route of persuasion, in which people can quickly access our mental states and can quickly persuade us of stuff. And we live in this time where the technology has really magnified the power of rhetoric. So we see these rhetoricians that have incredibly big audiences. The algorithm doesn't maximize for truth. The algorithm doesn't maximize for logos, the boring logos. The logos which asks you to pay attention to the steps, to be methodical in your thinking. It doesn't maximize for logos. The algorithm maximizes for ethos and pathos, for rhetoric. And this is a big problem in society because a part of society is, losing connection with truth. And this is an example of what's going on. Now, when you talk this vaguely, as Russell Brand just did, one of the problems also is the fact that you can always find a defense for your words. You can always say you've been misinterpreted. If I just say, Russell, was it appropriate to answer the question in this way? No, he can say, no, actually, there's a brilliant interpretation of my words that you completely missed. And I'm saying that logos emerges through pathos and ethos. And I actually don't want to impose things. I want to speak the word of God through logos too. Or I don't know, he could say whatever. But the problem is that it would be hard for me to then contradict him because anything goes, really. Anything goes. And you become immune to critique. You can immunize yourself from critique this way. And there's a second point I want to make that no political commentator is making currently. And I do this as a hobby, and I wish people were making this point more. But there's a growing literature in political science that has to do with correlates between cognitive styles and political positions. And it seems like we are finding some associations between system one thinking and certain political positions, as are increased authoritarian tendencies, increased dogmatic beliefs, an increase in conspiratorial belief, an increase in the willingness to use force to get your political ideas enacted. Although I should warn the viewer that this literature is quite fresh, and I'm being quite speculative here when I talk about it, so I'm not being as precise as I would be in an academic setting. But I think it's worthwhile to start talking about this even in these spaces where people do political commentary. There seems to be a certain connection here between certain aspects of perhaps ethos and pathos and certain political beliefs, and I would like this to be explored more. By the way, if somebody wants to learn more about this, I have some articles on my Substack concerning this. let me just say something that might be obvious to some, but if more people learn how to use logos better, then in a democracy, the democracy will perform much better because the policies will be much closer to truth. They will be more accurate because we know from our scientific models that the logos route gets you closer to truth. It avoids some biases. And so hopefully we can teach people to use their logos better. So yeah, I completely lost my cool again. Well, okay, I love you. Bye.